1.
The young lady was extremely disgusted by the silent and reserved guard, so she assigned me to him. She mocked, "An ugly girl paired with a mute, a perfect match indeed." I felt unworthy, but Xie Qi'an said I was his beloved and he should treat me well. Yet, when the young lady and I both fell into the water, Xie Qi'an instinctively saved her and escorted her away, completely forgetting about me. At first, I thought it was just his duty, until I saw the young lady crying as she threw herself into Xie Qi'an's arms. She said she regretted it and wanted him to take her away. On the day Xie Qi'an eloped with the young lady, I was implicated by the people of the Duke's Manor. They beat me to death with clubs and threw me into a pile of corpses. But later, at the border, I heard that Xie Qi'an, who had resumed his identity as the 19th prince, had frantically dug through the pile of corpses, covered in blood. He said he was looking for his wife. A boat was attacked by river bandits. Just now, the young lady and I fell into the water together. While struggling, I saw Xie Qi'an, who had been fighting the bandits, suddenly look anxious. Without a word, he jumped into the water and swam towards me. I felt relieved and reached out to him. "Qi'an, save." But Xie Qi'an seemed not to notice me. He quickly passed by me. In the end, he swam straight towards the young lady, who had somehow drifted further away. "Move aside." Perhaps he found me in the way, but the usually calm Xie Qi'an rudely pushed me aside. My forehead hit a piece of wood floating on the water. A sharp splinter cut my eye, and everything blurred with blood. But he still didn't notice me. I couldn't swim. The wound hurt. After struggling and swallowing several mouthfuls of water, my consciousness gradually faded. I vaguely heard the young lady say, "Save your beloved first, I can swim." But when I used the last bit of strength to turn my head, all I saw was Xie Qi'an carrying the young lady away without a second glance at me. His actions were tense, as if he was holding a precious treasure he had just regained. Maybe she noticed me. The young lady, who should have been weak, clung to Xie Qi'an's shoulder and suddenly lifted her gaze. She looked at me with pity and disdain. But it didn't matter. I thought to myself, after all, Xie Qi'an was the young lady's guard, so it was only right for him to save her first. Xie Qi'an carried the young lady to shore. I thought again, he should be coming to save me soon, right? I clung to that hope. But even as I lost consciousness, Xie Qi'an never looked back. He protected the young lady as they left the shore. And no one cared about me. Later, as my mind drifted into darkness, I vaguely sensed someone pulling me out of the water. Someone was tearing at my clothes.
It was those bandits.
I heard their lewd and evil laughter. But it stopped in the next second. Ugh, she's an ugly freak. So they threw me heavily onto the ground. My whole body hurt terribly. But it was okay because I was ugly. I thought in a daze, and then I completely lost consciousness.
2.
I had a hideous scar near my left eye. The people in the Duke's Manor whispered that I was extremely ugly. Yet despite my unsightly appearance, I was betrothed to the handsome Xie Qi'an. Xie Qi'an was the young lady's guard, but she despised him greatly. She told Xie Qi'an to get lost more than once, and finally, she laughed and said, "I think you and Ah Shu are a perfect match. An ugly girl paired with a mute, a perfect match indeed." And so, our marriage was decided. In truth, I was overjoyed. Xie Qi'an was highly skilled in martial arts and extremely handsome. Although he was silent and reserved, he fulfilled all my fantasies about a future husband. I knew I was unworthy of Xie Qi'an, so I tried my best to treat him even better. At first, Xie Qi'an rejected all my kindness, but hearts are made of flesh. Slowly, Xie Qi'an's attitude softened, and sometimes he would even say a word or two to me. I once earnestly told Xie Qi'an, "If you're unwilling, I can ask the young lady to annul our engagement." If that didn't work, my aunt had served the lady of the manor for many years and could probably help. But Xie Qi'an remained silent for a long while. Finally, in a hoarse voice, he said, "No need, this is fine." After that, Xie Qi'an started learning how to protect me. He remembered the foods I liked and would clumsily take care of me when I was ill. I thought it was because we had spent time together and Xie Qi'an treated me differently now. I was secretly happy for quite some time. But now, it seems, perhaps I was wrong again. 3. My aunt found me with the help of other guards in the manor. After being brought back to the Duke's manor, I was burning with fever. But when I woke up, only Xiaodai and my aunt were by my side. Xie Qi'an was still nowhere to be seen. My aunt sneered, saying he was probably still guarding the young lady's courtyard. It was then that I learned the young lady had inexplicably fainted after returning. I heard that Xie Qi'an had frantically gathered all the doctors in the city to treat her. And because the young lady didn't wake up for a long time, he wouldn't let the doctors leave. He spent the whole night guarding her courtyard. You had a high fever all night. For once, my aunt sounded resentful. When Alin brought you back, your head was covered in blood. I wanted to get a doctor for you, but the maids in the young lady's courtyard stopped me. In the end, a small medicine boy bravely fetched the medicine for you, but it left a scar. For a young lady, having a scar on her face. Perhaps realizing she had touched a sore spot, my aunt stopped talking, but her anger remained. The young lady's life is valuable, but doesn't yours matter too? What difference would it make to send a doctor to you? You are his legally wedded wife. Aunt. I stopped her. My eyes suddenly stung, and my heart felt heavy. But I smiled at my aunt and softly said, "The young lady is precious. It's only right to take extra care. Besides, Qi'an is the young lady's guard. He didn't do anything wrong. And you're still defending him. I heard that when you fell into the water, he didn't even." My aunt abruptly stopped, realizing she had said too much, and awkwardly changed the subject. I pretended not to notice and cheerfully comforted her. But after she left, I murmured to myself, people always forget something when they're anxious, right? And at that time, the young lady was more important. After all, just 2 days ago, Xie Qi'an told me, once he saved enough money to live independently, he would take me out of the manor to live a peaceful life. He also said I was his beloved and he should treat me well. I believed him and was very happy, because I felt that I had finally found a place in Xie Qi'an's heart. So this time, he definitely didn't forget me on purpose. 4. I was feverish for 2 days, but Xie Qi'an never returned. Miss was still in shock and needed someone to protect her. In my delirium, I had nightmares. In those dreams, Xie Qi'an abandoned me over and over again. I could only watch his back, sinking into the suffocating grasp of death, until I felt a cool touch on my forehead. Struggling to open my eyes, I called out, "Qi'an? Did I wake you?" Xie Qi'an's voice was low and hoarse. I shook my head. He pressed his lips together and then said, "I brewed some medicine. You'll feel better after you drink it." All right. The room was dark, so I couldn't see his expression. He remained silent for a long while before finally speaking again. Earlier. "I know you didn't forget about me on purpose," I interrupted him. "Those bandits were clearly after Mississippi. You're skilled in martial arts, so it was right for you to protect her first." I kept talking to myself, my voice trailing off. I wasn't sure if I was trying to comfort him or myself. Xie Qi'an froze for a moment. Though I couldn't see his face, I noticed how his tense body suddenly relaxed. "But it was my negligence that harmed you." "I'm sorry." Xie Qi'an awkwardly reached out to pat my head, trying to comfort me. "The scar on your face can be treated. I'll find a remedy for you in the future."
All right.
I responded with a cheerful smile, as always. My aunt often said I was too simple-minded. Outside, a heavy rain suddenly turned into a series of thunderclaps. My face turned pale, and I instinctively grabbed Xie Qi'an's hand. I feared the sound of thunder. Xie Qi'an stiffened again, and used a physical closeness with me. He instinctively tried to pull away, but then hesitated, stopping himself. "Ashiyu. Someone help." I heard Chunhong, Mrs. Personal Maid, calling out to the other guards. She said Miss was having night terrors again and needed some guards with strong yang energy to stand watch. Xie Qi'an's words were cut off. He instinctively stood up, his tone tinged with anxiety. Wasn't she just fine? Why is she having nightmares again? I sensed something was wrong and tightened my grip on Xie Qi'an's hand. Don't go. Chun Hong had already gathered the other guards at the door. I forced myself to stay awake, suppressing the tremble in my voice. Can you stay with me for a while? Besides, Chun Hong has already found others. They don't really need you, do they? The roaring thunder reminded me of the despair I felt when I was close to death. I desperately wanted Xie Qi'an to stay with me, but he hesitated only for a moment before gently pulling my hand away. I'll ask Xiaodai to stay with you. You just need to sleep, and everything will be fine. He didn't notice my fear or trembling, rushing out the door. But just as he reached the door, he paused. Hope flickered in my heart, and my eyes lit up. Miss is about to be married. Nothing can go wrong before that. As her guard, I have to check on her, Xie Qi'an said in a deep voice. I'll be back. Don't misunderstand, and don't speak of this to anyone. For the first time, I couldn't find the words to respond to him. I bit my lip, shaking, and I realized that his last words were likely the real reason he had come back. I fell into unconsciousness. When I woke up, those memories were hazy. Since others told me Xie Qi'an never returned, I thought it must have been another nightmare. Dreams and reality always seem to oppose each other, I thought. I was still waiting for Xie Qi'an to save enough silver to take me away. After all, he was the husband I had married, the person closest to me in this world besides my aunt. I should trust him. Until I saw Miss whipping him.
5.
There was no one else around, and Xie Qi'an just stood there silently, letting the whip fall on him. My first instinct was that Miss was using this as another excuse to punish Xie Qi'an. After all, when we encountered the bandits on the boat, the other guards were rewarded, but Xie Qi'an was left with nothing but injuries. Remembering that Xie Qi'an was already hurt, I wanted to step in and plead for him. But then I heard Miss suddenly drop the whip, her voice filled with both anger and hurt. Xie Qi'an, why won't you admit that you like me now? I froze. My steps halted as if I had turned to stone. Had I been so preoccupied lately that I was imagining things? Miss and Xie Qi'an. How could that be possible? But Xie Qi'an's body went rigid. He pressed his lips tightly together, and the emotions in his eyes were so complex that I dared not look too closely. Fine. Miss laughed bitterly. She suddenly pulled out a hairpin and fiercely stabbed it toward her own arm. But Xie Qi'an moved faster. The hairpin pierced his palm instead, blood dripping everywhere. His eyes were red, and there was a hint of desperate pleading in his voice. Please don't hurt yourself. The look in his eyes as he gazed at her held a tenderness I had never seen before. What does it matter if you don't admit it? Miss, usually so aloof, now looked fragile. She lifted her chin slightly, her voice harsh. You followed my orders and married that ugly wretch. Then you refused to divorce her because her voice sounds somewhat like mine, didn't you? Xie Qi'an, can you deny that when you're with her, in the dark where you can't see her face, you pretend she's me, just because of her voice? I snapped my head up, disbelief washing over me. My entire body turned cold. I suddenly remembered those rare moments of intimacy after our marriage. During those times, Xie Qi'an would show a bit of gentleness, softly coaxing me, Ashu, I want to hear your voice. But I kept my eyes on Xie Qi'an, desperately hoping he would deny it. Xie Qi'an didn't speak right away. It was as if his secret had been laid bare, and his face turned ghostly pale, full of shame. Finally, he turned his head away and spoke in a hoarse voice, I'm married. It seemed like he was saying it more to himself than to Miss. Yes, you're married, but only because I forced you to marry her, Miss said with a bitter smile, tossing the hairpin aside. She threw herself into Xie Qi'an's arms, clutching his clothes, her tears flowing freely. Xie Qi'an instinctively held her, hurriedly hiding his injured hand behind his back, too afraid to touch her as if worried his blood might soil her. But Xie Qi'an, I regret it. Miss clutched Xie Qi'an's clothes tightly, crying as if her heart would break. Now I realize that I actually like you. But before, I was too proud, thinking you weren't good enough for me, so I did everything to push you away. But if you truly love someone, how can you care about such things?
I don't want to marry that man.
He's a monster, and if I marry him, I'll die. I just want to marry you. Please take me away. Xie Qi'an's arms around Miss stiffened for a moment. He seemed too shocked to speak, his eyes downcast as if lost in thought. But after a long silence, I heard Xie Qi'an's voice again, rough and low. All right. Xie Qi'an agreed. 6. I don't know how I made it back to the room. The pastries I had meant to bring to Xie Qi'an were already cold. I quietly looked around and suddenly realized how few things here actually belonged to him. So few that if he ever decided he didn't want to stay, he could leave without a trace. Then why did he make such promises to me? Out of pity? I sat by the table, lost in thought, my mind wandering. I didn't even notice when Xie Qi'an returned. When he came back, he was covered in wounds again. The old injuries hadn't healed, and now there were new ones. Seeing me looking at him, Xie Qi'an instinctively explained, I failed to protect Miss, and she got hurt. I deserve to be punished. I nodded. Maybe it was my uncharacteristic coldness that made Xie Qi'an uneasy. Or perhaps it was his own guilt. He hesitated for a moment before softening his tone. I'm sorry to trouble you again. Xie Qi'an didn't like being touched by others. Even though we were married, I rarely had the chance to touch him. But Miss could leave her mark on him anytime, anywhere. Does it hurt? I asked softly as I looked at the fine scars on his back. He was always getting hurt because of Miss. Ashu. Xie Qi'an didn't answer my question. He turned his head to look at me, his handsome face serious. In a while, let's leave. My hand, which was applying medicine, paused. I didn't feel the same joy I had the first time I heard these words. Instead, an inexplicable unease welled up inside me. The words, "What about Miss?" almost slipped out of my mouth, but I forced them back down. Seeing that I hadn't responded, Xie Qi'an looked at me, puzzled. What's wrong? Nothing. I shook my head, then suddenly spoke. When I was injured and had a fever, Aunt said she couldn't find a doctor. As soon as I finished speaking, I felt the muscles under my hand tense up.
7.
I wanted an explanation from Xie Qi'an. Shout, I said, she went looking for you too. I looked into Xie Qi'an's eyes, persistent. Why didn't you come back with her, even if it was just to check on me? How could he not know you were hurt? I begged him, saying all we needed was a doctor to take a look, but Xie Qi'an said he had to wait until Miss woke up. He clearly never cared about you. Xiaoti's words from that day echoed in my ears. I had deliberately tried to forget them because I trusted Xie Qi'an. I believed that it was just his duty. I believed that Xie Qi'an protected Miss so carefully because she was his master. But now, every word pierced my heart. Some small details that should have been forgotten suddenly came back to me. For example, how Xie Qi'an would often stare blankly towards the southwest when he had free time. That was the direction of Mrs. Courtyard. Or the time I accidentally saw a red beaded hairpin at Xie Qi'an's place. I had thought it was a gift for me. I was so excited to try it on, but Xie Qi'an got angry. He carefully put the hairpin away, and then, when he saw me, hesitated. Sorry. Xie Qi'an apologized to me in a low voice, explaining that it belonged to someone else. I nodded, feeling a bit guilty. But that hairpin, which Xie Qi'an treasured so much, broke. It happened the day after Mrs. birthday. At the time, Xie Qi'an was injured, so I didn't bring it up. Eventually, I forgot about it altogether. Now, as I recalled everything, Xie Qi'an quickly returned to his usual self. He avoided my gaze. Miss was frightened, and those water bandits were an unknown threat. Someone had to stay by her side to protect her. Master Zhou doesn't trust anyone else. I actually came back to check on you. Xie Qi'an's voice grew quieter and quieter, but he never mentioned the doctor. I didn't say anything, just quietly watched him. I saw his hands clench into fists, his expression unusually flustered. At that time, Xie Qi'an pressed his lips together tightly. Ashu, I was wrong. A coldness spread through my heart. I looked away, forcing a smile. It's nothing to do with you. Miss is a noblewoman. It's natural for you to be careful with her. I'm just a servant and that's not it. For some reason, Xie Qi'an suddenly interrupted me, his tone urgent. His eyes reddened. But when I looked at him in confusion, he fell silent again. His gaze landed on the scar on my face. Xie Qi'an turned around. He reached out, his movements stiff and awkward as he touched the scar on my face. He pursed his lips and softly promised me, "Ashu is my beloved. I'll help you remove this scar, and I'll treat you very, very well." He had said these words many times. After every time we were intimate, when he planned to save up silver to take me away. Now that I think about it, these weren't promises. They were reminders and reassurances. I turned my head away from his gaze, my tone indifferent. "It's okay, I'm used to it, Ashu." But Xie Qi'an frowned. Ignoring the pain from his wound, he instinctively grabbed my hand and stared into my eyes, speaking slowly and deliberately. "I'll make sure your face heals. We'll leave here soon." His eyes were filled with obvious urgency. He held my hand so tightly that it hurt. I looked at Xie Qi'an for a long while. Seeing the growing anxiety in his eyes, I smiled at him, as I always did, and reassured him.
All right.
Only then did Xie Qi'an let out a sigh of relief.
8.
But Xie Qi'an broke his promise. 2 days before our wedding, he eloped with the eldest daughter of the Duke's Manor. As a result, I was implicated and blamed by the Duke's Manor. The cane was raised high, and then came down heavily on me. It hurt. My whole body hurt terribly. Aunt tried to plead for me, even attempted to throw herself over me to shield me, but she was held back. She cried out, "Tell them where Xie Qi'an is, Ashu. No matter how good Xie Qi'an might be, are you really going to abandon your aunt for him?" I forced a smile at Aunt, thinking that I actually wanted to tell them where Xie Qi'an was. But I didn't know. I didn't even know when he left. But no one believed me. They thought I was trying to protect Xie Qi'an. I wanted to say that Xie Qi'an wasn't that wonderful after all. It was just that he had saved my life once. It was just that he had stood up for me when others mocked and insulted me, telling me, "Ashu isn't ugly. They're the ones who are ugly." But now I had repaid him for everything. Amid the excruciating pain, I suddenly remembered that this wasn't the first time Xie Qi'an had abandoned me. So that wasn't just a fevered nightmare from my past. But this time, I didn't even get to see his back as he left. I was beaten until I was covered in blood. The people of the Duke's Manor had assumed I was Xie Qi'an's beloved. They thought he wouldn't be so heartless as to watch his beloved be tortured like this. But they were wrong. Even when I was more dead than alive, Xie Qi'an never showed up. In the end, when I seemed to stop breathing, the Duke coldly ordered them to throw me onto a pile of corpses. The stench of rotting flesh mixed with the scent of blood. Then, the eerie cries of birds rang out. After a while, I forced myself to crawl out of that pile of corpses, enduring the agony that racked my body. But at least I survived. You see, once I stopped trusting Xie Qi'an, I found a way to live. I crawled out. Now I no longer owe Xie Qi'an anything. I forced a smile, thinking this. But my whole body was in so much pain. I only had time to see a person before I passed out from the pain. When I woke up again, I was in a carriage. Alan, who was always praised by Aunt and Shout-Eye for being honest and dependable, had a cold expression as he swiftly dealt with the bandits who had blocked the road. Noticing that I had woken up, he spoke without turning his head. "I burned your house down. Nothing was left behind." I nodded. The valuables had already been taken by me, including the silver Xie Qi'an had saved up over the years. Alan paused, then said, "Xie Qi'an went back as the 19th prince. Years ago, during the palace coup, the emperor's favorite, the 19th prince, was kidnapped by traitors and disappeared without a trace. Alan had told me that Xie Qi'an was that 19th prince. He went back to being that high and mighty prince, so he probably won't mind that I took the silver he saved up all these years." I tried to console myself, thinking that Miss Zhou really was blessed. Alan said, "He dug through that pile of corpses for a long time, his hands covered in blood, saying he was looking for you." I was shocked. Could it be that he knew I took his silver? But I wasn't in that pile of corpses. Alan replied, "I found another body to replace you." Xie Qi'an believed it, and so did the imperial court. Just as I hadn't known Xie Qi'an was the 19th prince, Xie Qi'an probably never imagined that I was a remnant of the previous dynasty, someone the court had been searching for all along. Though I was just an unfavored princess from a cold palace. Alan continued. He ignored everyone's objections and took that body back, saying you were his wife and that he had promised to take you away. This time I was silent for a long time. After a while, I swung my legs and sighed with a smile. But Ashu is already dead. It's like milk coming in after the child is already gone. What's the point? Alan said nothing.
9.
Xie Qi'an's perspective. Xie Qi'an hurried back on the 4th day. He was supposed to return earlier to take Ashu away. But Zhou Zongxue suddenly fell ill and begged him to stay with her a little longer. Xie Qi'an hesitated. But when Zhou Zongxue tearfully asked, "Didn't you promise to always protect me?" he suddenly recalled that rainy night many years ago. The noble lady of the Duke's Manor had given a life-saving bun to a little beggar. She had even graciously said that if he survived, she would give him a way out. And so, the little beggar was taken away and eventually became Zhou Zongxue's bodyguard. It wasn't until recently that he regained his memories and learned of his true identity. Qian, Zhou Zongxue called softly, looking up at him. Her delicate face was streaked with tears, and the eyes that had never really seen him before were now focused solely on him. In a rare display of vulnerability, she asked, "Do you regret taking me away?" Her voice trembled. This was the scene Xie Qi'an had always wanted to see. He should have been happy. "Will you stay with me a little longer?" But for some reason, Xie Qi'an suddenly thought of Ashu. When Ashu was sick, she also hoped he would stay with her. But Ashu was sensible. She wouldn't throw a tantrum like Zhou Zongxue whenever he showed any sign of leaving. Even when she was ill, she was cautious, afraid of causing trouble for others. Xie Qi'an. Zhou Zongxue's voice grew louder, tinged with anger when he didn't respond immediately. And so, Xie Qi'an's mind wandered again, thinking that Ashu must have been angry too when he left her. But she had a good temper and never held it against him. It dawned on Xie Qi'an that he both liked and resented this not holding grudges. Suddenly, he wanted to see just how much Ashu could forgive. So he agreed to Zhou Zongxue's request and stayed 2 more days. But he still couldn't shake the urge to return, and with each passing day, he regretted it more and more. On the way back, Xie Qi'an kept thinking about how he would explain everything to Ashu. He also wondered if Ashu would be afraid once she learned he was the 19th prince. After all, she had once said she only wanted to live an ordinary, peaceful life. But Ashu was his beloved, and such a life was not meant for her. Xie Qi'an thought about this the entire journey. He also thought that no matter what, given that his birthday was coming up, Ashu would definitely go with him. But he never imagined he wouldn't even get a chance to explain. The house where they had stayed had been reduced to ashes, and his Ashu had long been beaten to death and thrown onto a pile of corpses. Xie Qi'an ignored the people who had knelt in panic, and he let Ashu's aunt curse him harshly. It wasn't until much later that he seemed to suddenly wake up. He dug through that pile of corpses for a long time, his hands covered in blood. Finally, in a corner, he found his Ashu. This place was often visited by wild dogs. Ashu's face had been bitten beyond recognition, and her body was mangled. Xie Qi'an didn't believe it. But everyone said this was Ashu. They said Ashu had been wearing this outfit that day. They said they had watched her die. Xie Qi'an still refused to believe it, until a green jade hairpin slipped from the tightly clenched hand of the corpse. It fell to the ground and shattered into several pieces. Xie Qi'an stiffened. It was the first gift he had given Ashu. But Ashu had never worn it. She had only treasured it, keeping it hidden away. And then she had joked that she would protect that hairpin even in death. But Ashu is dead. Ashu, the hairpin is broken. Xie Qi'an carefully cradled the corpse, whispering as if in a daze, "You broke your promise." His subordinates tried to console him. Xie Qi'an's expression was unreadable. "I told you to protect her." His subordinate's face turned ashen. Finally, one of them gritted his teeth and spoke up, "Your Highness, she was just a peasant girl." Everyone thought Ashu was unworthy of the 19th prince. The situation is dire, with several princes watching you closely. You cannot ruin your plans for her. Everyone urged him to consider the bigger picture. Xie Qi'an knew all of this. So he simply took Ashu back and ordered an ice coffin to be made for her. Apart from that, he was no different from his usual self. On the way back, Xie Qi'an came across the same water bandits who had been drinking. From these bandits, Xie Qi'an learned that Zhou Congxue's earlier fall into the water had not been an accident. She had bribed the bandits. She had wanted Ashu to die in that accident, without tarnishing her own reputation. She had even planned to have Ashu's honor ruined. But she was just an ugly freak, one drunken bandit spat, laughing. Who would ever want a hideous? Before he could finish, Xie Qi'an stabbed him through with a sword. Clean this up. Xie Qi'an's face was emotionless. Everyone assumed he was protecting the lady of the Duke's Manor. One of his subordinates sighed in relief, saying, "I knew that woman didn't matter to His Highness." Xie Qi'an heard this. He simply lowered his eyes and continued wiping his sword. The wounds on his hands had been treated with the best medicine and were nearly healed. Just like when one person dies, another, better person comes along. There would always be someone to fill that place. Ashu really didn't matter much, Xie Qi'an thought to himself. But his eyes suddenly darkened. Like storm clouds rolling in, their depths were unfathomable.
10.
I opened an inn in the borderlands. The inn saw many travelers, and I often heard interesting stories. For instance, the noble lady of the Duke's Manor hadn't eloped as people thought. Instead, she encountered bandits while praying for her fiancé at a temple. Although she was unharmed, the shock delayed her wedding. I also heard that the emperor's most beloved 19th prince became a thorn in the side of many princes upon his return. But within just 4 years, he ascended to the throne. And recently, the court ceased its pursuit of remnants from the previous dynasty, reportedly due to a new policy from a new emperor. But I wasn't interested in any of that. What I cared about was, where's Aunt? I looked past Alan, but didn't see the person I longed to meet, and my gaze dimmed instantly. Mumbling to myself, I wondered, could Aunt still be angry with me? Song Auntie isn't angry. The little butterfly Alan brought back comforted me. She said, as long as you're alive, that's enough. The family has treated her well, so she won't come here to burden you and suffer more. Song Auntie also said she's been waiting for you, that heartless little brat, to tell her that you're alive and well. She just didn't expect that she would have to wait for 4 years. Her words made me both laugh and cry. Back then, the court was close to discovering my identity. So, I seized the opportunity to fake my death during the incident between Xie Qi'an and Zhou Congxue. But I couldn't tell Aunt about any of this, nor could I drag her into it. It wasn't until now, when I was finally safe, that I dared to send Alan to the capital to find Aunt. Alan had been sent by those from the previous dynasty to find me, but I managed to turn him to my side. After all, I never thought that a princess from a cold palace like me could bear the burden of restoring a fallen dynasty, especially since the current emperor is actually quite good. Fortunately, Alan also had no ambition. So the two of us took the money and fled straight to the borderlands. Now, at last, this concern has been resolved. Alan said he would have to return to the capital in a couple of days and asked me to prepare anything I wanted to say or send. I agreed. I had just received a ginseng plant from a merchant from the western regions a couple of days ago. I hurried home to retrieve it. But as soon as I opened the courtyard door, I sensed something was wrong. Just as I was about to turn and leave, everything suddenly went black. My body was trapped between the door and someone's body. Cold fingers cautiously touched my cheek, restrained yet intense. Rushed breath sounded in my ear, and the voice that spoke was eerily familiar, trembling slightly. Ashu, I found you. My body went rigid. 11. I never expected Xie Qi'an to find me. Nor did I expect him to find me so quickly. He blindfolded me but held me tightly, his whole body trembling violently. He kept calling my name over and over. Ashu, Ashu. He seemed like a lovesick fool. I grew a bit impatient and pushed him away, saying, "Please." But the words caught in my throat. I hadn't used much force, but Xie Qi'an, a martial artist, was easily pushed away by me. He even stumbled back a few steps, finally supported by someone. I looked at him in shock, my brow furrowing. "Why are you crying?" Large tears rolled down his cheeks. Xie Qi'an looked at me, his eyes red. His lips trembled as he spoke, aggrieved and helpless. "My dear, you hurt me." "Me? Who is this person?" Ashu, one of Xie Qi'an's subordinates, finally coughed awkwardly and explained. His Majesty was poisoned and lost his memory.
12.
Saying he lost his memory is an understatement. It's more like he lost his mind. Now, aside from remembering that I'm his beloved and that he needs to find his beloved, Xie Qi'an remembers nothing else. They said he was ambushed on his way to find me. So, I asked, amused and wary, as I glared at the people in front of me. I have nothing to do with your emperor. His poisoning and memory loss are not my concern. To put it bluntly, I suffered a lot because of Xie Qi'an back then. Aren't you afraid I might take this opportunity to harm him? I wouldn't dare kill him. After all, Xie Qi'an is the emperor. But I could always find ways to torment a fool who insists on clinging to me. Xie Qi'an's subordinates immediately paled. One of them snapped. "How dare you? Do you know?" But before he could finish, Xie Qi'an kicked him aside. He stood firmly in front of me, his expression fierce and cold. "No one is allowed to bully my dear." There was a hint of a ruler's ruthlessness in him. But the next second, Xie Qi'an turned to me, his eyes bright with a smile. "My dear, I will protect you." This man's personality had completely changed after losing his mind. I didn't respond, just distanced myself coldly from Xie Qi'an. He froze, his expression instantly falling into dejection. Ashu, the leader of his men, sighed, his tone firm. "His Majesty instructed that you take care of him when he was lucid. We are only following orders. But please think carefully before you act. After all, His Majesty's poisoning is only temporary, and those who protect him in secret are far less lenient than we are." I understood the threat in his words. Anger flared up inside me, but was eventually suppressed. I looked coldly at Xie Qi'an, who was trying to inch closer to me, and frowned in frustration. "Fine. 13. Xie Qi'an ended up staying at my inn. To avoid causing trouble, his subordinates disguised his appearance. I didn't know how many people were secretly protecting him, so I only warned Alan and Xiaodai to keep their distance from him. Xiaodai didn't seem to mind, but Alan might have guessed something. I stopped him from pursuing it further. Xie Qi'an always stayed close to me. He didn't do much, just quietly watched me, as if that alone was enough to satisfy him. Sometimes he'd try to help with chores, but he was always clumsy. Whenever he messed up, he would look at me, bewildered and helpless, whispering, "Ashu, I'll make it right." I ignored him. As long as he didn't cause more trouble, I pretended he wasn't there. "Where did this little tail of yours come from? Always following you?" Lu Qian, the owner of Zushang Tower, glanced at Xie Qi'an and clicked his tongue. "He's really ugly." The customs in the borderlands were quite liberal. Though Zushang Tower was officially a tea house, most of its patrons were women. I had recently collaborated with Lu Qian on a batch of cosmetics. "Need help getting rid of him?" As Lu Qian spoke, he leaned in slightly, his fox-like eyes filled with a mischievous smile. "Seeing as you're one of my regular customers." He deliberately drew out the last word, laced with a hint of flirtation. I sighed. "Boss Lu, get away from her." Before I could finish, Lu Qian was yanked away. His already loose clothing now hung open, revealing a large expanse of his pale chest. Xie Qi'an instantly stepped in front of me, his face dark, shameless. "You're quite rude." Lu Qian calmly adjusted his clothes, his expression growing cold. "It's improper for a servant to interrupt when I'm speaking with your master. Boss Shu is too kind-hearted. Perhaps you should leave this man to me for a proper lesson." Xie Qi'an pursed his lips, a flash of anger briefly appearing in his eyes. But I cut him off impatiently. "Xie Qi'an, get out." Xie Qi'an seemed to freeze. He looked at me with disbelief, his eyes suddenly filled with hurt. He had barely uttered "dear" before I silenced him with a glare. I spoke coldly. "Don't force me to throw you out." It was ironic. Years ago, I had desperately wished for Xie Qi'an to call me dear, but he never did. Now that I no longer cared, he couldn't stop saying it. Xie Qi'an's gaze lowered slightly. When he looked up again, he had calmed down. All right. He smiled at me, the anger in his eyes receding, replaced by a gentle and obedient expression. Then I'll wait for you outside, Ashu. I ignored him. Lu Qian clicked his tongue and publicly accused him. Ashu, your servant glared at me. He looked so fierce, like he was going to charge at me and kill me any second. Ashu, I'm so scared. Xie Qi'an stiffened, then quickened his pace to leave. I looked down at Lu Qian, who seemed to want to curl up in my arms, and smiled slightly. Since you've ruined my reputation, I'll take an extra cut of the profits. Lu Qian instantly became serious. That won't do.
14.
Lu Qian was a sly old fox. I still lacked the experience to deal with him properly. But since he was willing to teach, I was willing to learn. As for payment, there would always come a time to settle debts. Even though Lu Qian often joked about paying with people instead of money. Most of the time, I just laughed it off and didn't take it seriously. The scar on my face still remained. At first, it was to avoid being recognized. Later, I found that this ugly appearance allowed me to enjoy a rare peace in this borderland. When I went out, I didn't see Xie Qi'an. But since there were always people protecting him, I didn't bother to get involved. It wasn't until late at night when I was sound asleep that I vaguely felt someone beside me. When I struggled to open my eyes and saw the scene before me, my pupils contracted sharply.
Dear.
Xie Qi'an turned his head to smile at me, seemingly unaware of what he was doing. But now his clothes were half open. His loose inner garment hung loosely on his shoulders, with a glimpse of a golden chain draping down from his collarbone to his chest. As he moved slightly, there was a faint jingling sound. I had seen this kind of attire before in Lu Qian's Zushang Tower. Lu Qian had worn it a few times himself, but I had always thought he used it as a gimmick to attract customers and never paid much attention. Now, seeing Xie Qi'an dressed like this, he furrowed his brows in innocent confusion. Looking at me, he pouted. Dear, it's uncomfortable. But I suddenly felt calm. I quietly observed Xie Qi'an, noticing a trace of panic he unknowingly revealed. But he quickly hid it again. Dear Ashu. Xie Qi'an quickly corrected himself, his voice dropping as if he had done something wrong. I thought you liked this. His tone was careful, as if afraid I would get angry. The roles had reversed. In the past, I was always the one concerned about Xie Qi'an's feelings. Now, I couldn't quite describe how I felt. It was like a weight was pressing on my chest, stuck neither up nor down. But that pressure was quickly replaced by a surge of anger. I tugged at the corner of my mouth. You don't have to do this. Ashu. Xie Qi'an called my name, sounding anxious. Did I do something terrible before? Are you so angry that you don't plan to forgive me? By the end, his voice was trembling. He gently tugged at the hem of my clothes. Xie Qi'an's voice was almost pleading. Ashu, I know I was wrong. Can you give me another chance? His voice was tinged with a subtle sense of grievance. I calmly pulled my clothes out of his grasp and smiled at him, in the same soothing tone as always. All right. A faint light flickered in Xie Qi'an's eyes. 15. Since that day, my attitude towards Xie Qi'an softened somewhat. At least, I no longer kept a constant cold expression as I had before. Aylin noticed the change in my demeanor and frowned, coming to ask me, Are you planning to forgive him? I lowered my head, busy with my abacus, and instead of answering directly, I asked, When you returned to the capital this time, did you find out how the eldest daughter of the Duke's mansion is doing now? Aylin's face remained stern, clearly unwilling to answer. Aylin. Not well, he finally responded stiffly. The Duke's mansion has fallen, but she still married Prince Zhao. However, Prince Zhao is rough in his ways and has certain peculiar habits in the bedroom. Not long after marrying him, Zhou Congxue was crying and making a fuss about wanting to go back, but no one paid attention to her. Later, she managed to escape, only to be captured by bandits for several days. When she returned, her chastity had been violated, and her face was. Aelin suddenly stopped. I didn't mind his pause and simply asked, "Did Prince Zhao take her back?" Aelin grunted in affirmation, his expression growing even more unpleasant. He has gained quite the reputation for being deeply affectionate among the women. Do you really think Prince Zhao is the kind of person to be so magnanimous? I asked again. Aelin fell silent. I chuckled and continued tinkering with the abacus. If we're being honest, Xie Qi'an and I are still technically husband and wife. But now he… Aishu. Xie Qi'an's voice suddenly cut in, interrupting Aelin. He walked toward me, subtly pushing Aelin aside, and eagerly presented the item in his hands to me like a treasure. Aishu, do you like it? In recent days, Xie Qi'an had been constantly finding ways to give me gifts. I took the red jade earrings from him, a flash of surprise in my eyes. I do. Then, may I put them on for you? Xie Qi'an asked cautiously. I hesitated, then smiled at him.
Sure.
Xie Qi'an pressed his lips together, and with trembling hands, he gently helped me put on the earrings. Aelin, however, never finished what he had been about to say.
16.
Xie Qi'an's poison remained unresolved for a long time. His subordinates were frantically searching for renowned doctors, but their master seemed not the least bit worried. Soon, Xie Qi'an's birthday approached. I told him that I hoped there wouldn't be too many people around on that day. I want to celebrate your birthday properly. Xie Qi'an almost immediately agreed to my request, his eyes curving into a soft smile. Anything Aishu wants, I'll agree to. So on the day of his birthday, Xie Qi'an didn't keep too many hidden guards by his side. I took him along the most bustling street of the border town, recounting to him the things that had happened to me here. Xie Qi'an listened attentively, but whenever he heard about the hardships I endured, he couldn't help but tightly grasp my hand, his eyes filled with guilt and pain. He promised me, "I will treat you well, Aishu." "It's all in the past now," I said, smiling at the rare liveliness around us. As we reached the end of the street, everything would come to an end. Xie Qi'an didn't seem to notice anything. He continued to carefully select gifts for me until the sound of hurried hoofbeats approached, followed by the clash of weapons. The faint scent of blood began to permeate the air. I pulled my hand away from his, and in Xie Qi'an's shocked gaze, I took a few steps back, tilting my head with a smile. Playing the fool is rather difficult, after all. Xie Qi'an, you'd better return to being the emperor. Chapter 17. Xie Qi'an is not a man of mercy, especially not during the struggle for the throne, where his brothers showed him no mercy either. After ascending to the throne, he dealt with them harshly, either killing or exiling them. The few remaining princes were outwardly respectful, but harbored their own schemes. Running an inn has its advantages. With so many people from all walks of life coming and going, I picked up on more information. And besides, Xie Qi'an was one of the third prince's men. I gave Xie Qi'an's personal jade pendant to him. Xie Qi'an stared at me, his smile slowly fading. He reverted to his old self, but his eyes were now bloodshot. He swallowed hard, his voice hoarse as he said, "Aishu knew that night." It wasn't a question.
I didn't respond.
So Xie Qi'an began to laugh quietly, the sound gradually growing louder until it seemed almost maniacal. "You lied to me again. For years ago, you lied to me, making me think you were dead. Now, for years later, you're lying to me again." His voice abruptly cut off. Xie Qi'an covered his mouth with his hand and coughed, each sound more ragged than the last, blood staining the corners of his lips. Yet he kept his eyes fixed on me, reaching out with a trembling hand. His tone was soft, almost pleading. "Aishu, we're still husband and wife. Come back with me. The position of empress has always been waiting for you. If you're still angry, you can hit me or scold me, I won't resist. But Aishu, you should come home." A long time ago, I had longed for a home. Xie Qi'an had once promised to take me away, but I no longer believed in such promises. So I shook my head. "You lied to me before, but I also used the excuse of fleeing from the marriage to fake my death. I suppose that makes us even." "It's not something that can be evened out." Someone suddenly attacked Xie Qi'an. He allowed the blade to pierce his body, breaking the attacker's neck in return, his demeanor still calm. His dark eyes bore into mine. Shu, I owe you so much. You should take it all back. A strange chill crept over me. I pressed my lips together, knowing that Xie Qi'an had changed, and much more than I had expected. Shu. Xie Qi'an tried to move closer to me, but after just 2 steps, his face suddenly twisted in pain. I had poisoned him. As I looked past him at the figures approaching in the distance, I laughed softly. Xie Qi'an, you see, you never really trusted me either. Xie Qi'an's men had arrived. The third prince was destined to lose. 18. This was actually within my expectations. What surprised me was that the third prince would use Xie Qi'an to threaten me. Dear little lover, he said with a vicious gleam in his eyes, if you want to save your little lover, then kill him now. Once again, it was a choice between 2 options. Xie Qi'an, the old fox who always cared about his appearance, was now in a terribly disheveled state. He struggled to open his eyes to look at me and clicked his tongue. Then he closed his eyes again, seemingly having no hope left. Xie Qi'an watched me quietly. The people around seemed eager to rush forward, but he stopped them. He was waiting for my reaction. But what was there to anticipate? I picked up the dagger at my feet and walked over to Xie Qi'an. I steadily drove the dagger into a spot near his heart. Xie Qi'an seemed to be in excruciating pain. He arched his back, and a profound, suffocating stillness surrounded him. Yet, he continued to stare at me unwaveringly. He said softly, Shu, today is my birthday. Do you really want to hurt me for the sake of others? Little Miss Shu, what are you doing? Xie Qi'an yelled angrily. I ignored him and seriously told Xie Qi'an, I have no way back, Xie Qi'an. I won't bear your child, which would be a mark of purity. I won't be involved with other men, which would be a sign of chaos. I won't be jealous of the women around you, which would be disorderly. You should divorce me. Now, I kill my husband and my... Shut up. Xie Qi'an suddenly erupted in fury, veins bulging on his forehead. I told you to shut up. But I continued calmly. I kill my husband and my emperor and become a remnant of the previous dynasty. You should kill me. I was pushing myself to the edge, forcing Xie Qi'an as well. The third prince was killed. Xie Qi'an was rescued. Yet the surroundings remained eerily silent. Is it that unwilling for you to return with me? Xie Qi'an asked, his eyes filled with a blood-red hue. I didn't answer, only saying, I suddenly remembered something. Years ago, a little beggar saved my life when I was being pursued. The scars on my face were left at that time. Later, I carried him from a dilapidated temple while he had a high fever, begging from house to house for help. Yet the little beggar seemed to only remember the young lady who had given him a steamed bun. Xie Qi'an's body stiffened suddenly. But now I feel that the little beggar doesn't seem to have forgotten everything. I laughed again. Xie Qi'an, your love is conditional and I don't need it. It's not like that. He instinctively tried to explain in a flurry, but I cut him off. You ask why I'm unwilling to return with you. Then I ask you, when you remembered you were the 19th prince, did you ever think of still making me your legitimate wife? Xie Qi'an opened his mouth, but remained silent. I knew Xie Qi'an too well. He wouldn't. Others wouldn't allow it either. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been beaten to death by the Duke's mansion. You don't love me. So I spoke each word deliberately. You are just accustomed to my unconditional goodness and unwilling to be abandoned by someone of a lower status. These words were a gamble. I was betting on whether my life could be preserved. I had already handed over the inn to Ailin and Xiao Dai. My aunt was also being looked after. Only my life remained. An oppressive silence followed. After a long while, Xie Qi'an began to cough violently. It was a soul-wrenching, heartbreaking cough. But he only coldly wiped the blood from his lips. My hand was covered in warmth. Xie Qi'an had grasped my hand and brutally drove the dagger in further. You haven't killed your husband or emperor. Xie Qi'an struggled to speak, his words labored with pain, but still loud enough for everyone to hear clearly. It was I who commanded you to do this. With the authority of an emperor. But his eyes were red-rimmed, filled with pain and despair. 19. Xie Qi'an left. Before he departed, he said he would wait for me to return at any time. I ignored him. I don't know what Xie Qi'an did. Fortunately, no one disturbed me. I remained a small innkeeper on the border, contentedly earning money and listening to the gossip of people from all walks of life. Occasionally, I did some business with Lu Qi'an and played with Ailin and Xiao Dai's child. Later, I heard that Xie Qi'an, unable to withstand the pressure, still established a successor. Such things tend to happen once, then again. It's quite normal, but it no longer concerned me. After all, I was just a small innkeeper trying to make a living.